Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Alex, for those kind words. Thank you, Melinda, for inviting me here to speak on this topic at BALEAP. It's a real honour and a pleasure to be here. I'd like to acknowledge the EAP practitioner participants in this study right at the outset, without whom this wouldn't be possible. Just before I move into the talk, I want to say that on a personal level, it's very meaningful to be here. I don't know, well, you wouldn't know, but in fact, my mother's family came from 40 miles from here in Settle in the Yorkshire Dales. And my mother's cousin was Professor of Engineering here at Leeds. So growing up in New Zealand from the age of 8, Leeds and Settle were common words, topics of conversation in our household, so it's a real pleasure to be here. So this is my theme and my topic, and I think the theme of the conference is really apt because EAP practitioners work in a context of ongoing change. They're required to form and reform who they are, moment by moment, and also as the field moves forward. So agency is a very useful tool for us to inquire into practice because it looks at the actions teachers take, the changes in the environment, and then their actions in response to those changes. So if you think, for example, as teachers, we're always concerned to restructure the classroom environment moment by moment, whether it's by asking a question, changing a task, and so on, to optimize the learning experience. Agency allows us to track that. So agency is very different from, if you think how I described it, it's the individual and the context, which are really important. So it's a very different frame from teacher cognition, which is much more about the ideas people have in their heads, their beliefs, their skills, their knowledge. Agency focuses on the actions that are taken. So this is a very grainy picture. I want you to look at that picture because I think agency is at the core of EAP practice. Have a look and see what you can make out in that picture. Any volunteers of things? When did it happen? When did this take place? Can you see? In the 80s, yes. In 1982, yes. It says the second seminar on teaching English for Science and Technology at the top. On the left here, now changed beyond recognition, is Charles Alderson. And this is a seminar that was convened by Chris Candlin and Charles Alderson in 1981 and 82, which was one of the earliest ones on how do we teach English for Science and Technology. It takes place in Bangkok, in Thailand, at King Mongkut Institute of Technology. Had the picture been clearer, you would see that the person in the foreground is me. And of course, I look, unlike Charles Alderson, of course, I look exactly the same. So this was me in a very early stage of my career. And what was I doing there? Well, yes, I was an EAP teacher. I'd worked in a university, Victoria University at that stage. I'd taught linguistics and applied linguistics, and I'd worked as an EAP practitioner. I found EAP the most challenging of those three roles because you're not working with a set body of content, as we know. This seminar was looking at how do we, these two seminars, were looking at how do we teach English for Science and Technology, we know that. But there they were trying to decide how to act in relation to two major moves in the field, communicative language teaching and learner needs. They were emerging. So how do we do this? It's not just about choice of text, it's about learner needs, brings work, and also communicative approaches. And my role there was that I was teaching EAP in Thailand on a New Zealand government project, and I understood Thai teachers and I spoke Thai. So my role was to mediate between these people who've come in from outside and my own experience. I tell this story because it tells us quite a bit about agency. That in that role, I felt I had real accountabilities. I had accountabilities to Thai teachers because I knew the context in which they worked. But I also had some accountabilities to broader issues in the profession because I was an applied linguist and I understood about communicative language teaching and learner needs and the way the field was developing. So we didn't look at agency as a frame then, but it does come to, I'm going to suggest that agency is at the core of EAP practice. Agency is at the core, but so are teachers. Helen Busturtman in 2017 wrote an article saying they've been relatively neglected compared to focus on language and learners. We've only focused peripherally on teaching and teachers' needs. I would argue that this is true, but also a key issue is we haven't seen EAP practitioners as agents in their own right. When we've looked at them, we have tended to look at them in relation to learners. So in this talk, we're going to be looking very much at practitioners in their own right. Of course, the same year, major work came out. This book has to take the record for the most cited book at a conference. And here, what Alex and Ian argue there is that there's been, in our field, there's been a lot of focus on questions like skills and so on, but we've neglected more ontological aspects like identity and agency, in other words, who people are. And this is what we're going to look at here. So I think we're seeing something of a shift in the field. It's nice to pick these and to see where the gaze is turning. Okay. So also last year, Ken Highland and Liz Hemp-Lyons have said this about our field. We failed to establish scholarship of teaching and to establish the value of our work and the status of our professions. I would argue that you never establish these things for good. It's an ongoing work, and I think we've made huge progress. Liz Hemp-Lyons says, a need for practitioner research, but also EAP teachers should be the most intellectually ambitious, the most creative and imaginative, and the most adventurous of teachers. Goodness. Wonder what that means. I think if we look at, through the data that I'm going to show you here, at the kinds of things teachers need to be doing as they're transitioning to scholarship, I think you'll begin to get a sense of the complexity of some of the steps people are taking to develop practitioner research. And I think that I'll leave it for you to judge how you view these critiques. Okay, so this is the outline of my talk. I'm going to talk a bit about agency, then scholarship. Then I'm mostly going to present data. Okay, so 3 and 4 are data. Oh, there's no number 5. Well, there is. That's the conclusion. Isn't it great when you get things wrong? Okay, cool. So I'm going to look a little bit more on agency and how it matters. So basically, and I'm going to build your understanding of agency. So here it's the actions people take at particular moments in particular contexts. So I want you to to get a sense of the particularity of agency. So it's time and place. It's at this moment with this set of circumstances. I like to think of it almost as like a freeze frame. You know, what was happening at that moment. And then you choose to act and shape your environment in a particular way. So that's agency as well. By the way, Engstrom described agency as a move away from a given frame of action. And that might be very helpful for you to think too. So we're not going to kind of be thinking about agency in relation to the absolute routine, like breathing, That is a given frame of action, but it really comes into play as a powerful frame when there's a move away from a given frame of action for a whole variety of reasons. And as I've said, our field is characterised by the need for that, by ongoing change. So, I'm just going to turn to you at the moment, right now, and to the BALEAP discussion list. And on the 25th of January, at the height of the New Zealand summer, I was looking at the BALEAP discussion list because I thought if I tracked it for 3 weeks, I'm going to see some very interesting things about issues that arise and points of change. So sit back, relax, and let's have a look at this. So the first one here is we're considering making some changes in the weightings of our assessments. So we're considering that. So this is teachers, he or she doesn't say why, but we're thinking about this. So assessment weightings. Next one, this one, we're going to do a third BALEAP res tes. We're looking for ideas, okay? So again, people are input and ideas. So people are asking, we're going to do a third one, a new one. How shall we act? What shall we do? How will we set this up? Would you like to make suggestions? Then, a little bit later, use of laptops in listening assessments. I'm going to come back to this one in a minute and analyse it in more detail. So, does anybody, by the way, use laptops in listening assessments? Hands up. Nobody. Oh, yes, some do. Okay, cool. So, yeah, 1 or 2. Right, so this is what this is about. So, this one here, we are questioning if we should also allow laptops to be used for note-taking under exam conditions. So, this is this idea in our field, we're constantly thinking, we're questioning, is this something that we should be doing? And look at that in a moment. This is summer support. Pilot, we have been asked to pilot summer period support aimed at students studying for research. So they've asked to do that. So again, deciding how should we act, what should we do. And this one, the old favourite, I need to consider our workload model. And then going on, here are a few questions I have in mind. So this was over a period of 3 weeks. Okay, but I found it very interesting to track that. Very nice. So I just want to go back, now looking again at agency. So it's how people act. It's in relation to the environment. So how they appraise and use the affordances of the environment. So that's an important point because in what is the same physical environment, different people see different affordances, different opportunities in that. And as I've already pointed out, that reciprocity between individuals and the environment, you reshape the environment and then you need to act in relation to the new environment. But agency also includes the meaning or significance that we attach to people or objects or events. I'm going to show this later. And also your sense of accountability. So let's look at this one again. I'll read it out. We're currently developing a new listening assessment on our pre-sessional. To date, we've required students to take lecture notes by hand as part of the assessment. However, we're keen to maintain authenticity in our assessments. That's a real principle in our field, isn't it? And we're very aware that the vast majority of students now take notes on laptops, enabling them to synchronously check the validity of information, vocabulary, etc. We are questioning, there's kind of a therefore in there, if we should also allow laptops to be used for note-taking under exam conditions. And then we're wondering whether people have similar questions and conclusions. So if we look at this from an agency perspective, so there's action, context, and awareness of responsibility. We can analyse it this way. Starting by the context, new listening, we need to do a new listening assessment, and also the wider context in higher education of note-taking on laptops. So that's the context. They're looking around thinking, oh, this is the context. It's not just context, though, it's an awareness of responsibility to have things as authentic as possible. So when we act, we also act with an awareness of a responsibility. And then the actions they take at the moment are questioning and wondering. Questioning if we should do this and wondering what do others do. So agency is a very nice way to map this. Okay, so basically for agency, for this talk, I want it to be useful to think in terms of action, context, and awareness there. Okay, there are many theoretical approaches to agency. I'm using Van Lier's work in this. They're all very different. Okay, so now I just want to very briefly mention scholarship. It's been such a focus in the conference that, I can carry this with me. It's been such a focus in the conference. So, and of course in BALEAP, research and scholarship are elided here. And you don't need to read this, but they're saying this program is a vehicle for promoting and sustaining transitions from practitioner to scholar and researcher. So that transition is never a transition, it's a movement between the two, isn't it? And it's trying to get that movement between those different roles. So research and scholarship this was launched in 2018. This is very important. In the wider field, this is a very standard definition of scholarship. Here, it needs to be public, open to critical review, and accessible for exchange and use. However, in this talk, I'm going to argue that the grand narratives about scholarship or the arguments about definitions of scholarship are much less useful or important for us compared to actually our practices, which you'll get a view of now. So that's scholarship. And what I wanted to, in the abstract, I put these questions on as some of the kinds of questions I'm going to address in this talk. Okay, so I need now to say how this project came about. So in fact, I was talking with Alex about agency and the work I've done with agency in refugee classrooms when there's sudden conflict. And we thought about it and decided that this will be really good, a very good framework to look at the EAP practitioner transitioning into scholarship. So basically what I'm going to show you is from the project began in 2017, and the participants were 19 EAP practitioners, as you can see, in New Zealand, Thailand, UK, and Viet Nam. So I deliberately went sort of across the world because trying to kind of widen up our perspective on that. The methodology is quite important. So I'll just mention this. At the start, each participant was invited to give a written narrative, 3 written narratives about transitioning to scholarship. That was a deliberate choice there because, first of all, when you're working with teachers, it's important that they disclose only what they want to disclose and how they talk about themselves, and also that they have opportunities for deep reflection. So this was very useful. That was followed by an individual interview, then focus group discussions. This turned out to be a huge amount of data. Not everybody did everything. Honestly, I never ever learn. So I have about 60 narratives. On average, each person did about 4 pages on average. So that's a huge amount of data. So that's about 80 pages of data. And then the interviews, which went from about 3/4 of an hour to an hour, and then the focus group. So I've been swimming in this. Not drowning, I will not drown, but swimming in this. But it's been really fascinating. So, now, the approach taken here is a narrative accounts approach. This is important because we're not interested in this approach as to what really happens in people's lives, but how individuals give account of themselves to someone else. So how do they choose to present themselves in their situation? And the view is that when you tell something, you're accounting for events and also accountable to others. You're also accountable to yourself. So, and that aspect will come up. This was an example of a narrative. I decided to take the step towards scholarship when, at that time in my work, people were invited to change the prompts. They were only suggestions. Good. So I'm now going to look at some of these, some of the results. And the little 1, 2, and 3 are important. I'm going to look first of all at agency and trajectory. What happened? What can we learn from looking at someone over time? The second one, I'm going to look at someone from Viet Nam in quite a different context. The third one, I'm going to look at 3 people at different stages of scholarship. So let's turn to Amy now, and I'm just going to tell you the story very quickly of Amy. Amy decided to do a master's degree. Then she presented her research at a first major conference. She did workshops for colleagues. She got published and carried on doing other research. And she said she now sees the value of research. Now, that's a very flat description of Amy. If we look at Amy from an agency perspective, we can get a really rich picture of what was going on there. So, and her change over time. So the idea of trajectory, if you look how someone acts at a moment, that's all you see. But if you look at actions from different vantage points over time, you see trajectory. This isn't a cause and effect. I'm not saying this is a recipe, follow this trajectory. But I think it's really interesting to think about and model your own trajectory. Here, there's the actions Amy took, but she didn't just take those actions. She was actually doing that in response to what was important for herself and what was important to others or for others. And others can mean people or contexts. So very briefly, we'll just look at 3. So deciding to do the MA, Amy felt that she hadn't pushed her own identity as a scholar researcher. This was very important for her. She said, for me, I really want to see how far I can go. She also felt it was important for the classroom. She works with refugees and had issues, there were issues there which she said are not dealt with in the literature. So she wanted to research that. And also for her family, she said she wanted her children to see her moving forward in her work. That was a very successful project. Then she did another project. She saw the value of that. Just look at the middle one. By this stage, she said, but I realized it's not just about me. I've done this for me and for the classroom and for the students, but I also need to think about my colleagues. So she did a workshop, and that was for her colleagues. She said that was the most demanding thing she did because her colleagues weren't interested in scholarship, but they wanted to see the practical value. So to distill that practical value was the most demanding aspect for her, far more than publications. Because I think she felt they were kind of like biting the money. Let's see how useful this actually is for us who are doing the work. I think we know this stance. Okay, she then went on and did more publications, again for her family. Her son by that stage, she's from Sweden originally. Her son was studying in Sweden, and she really wanted to kind of keep pushing her identity. And then at the end, she said, for herself, I now feel I'm a constant researcher. She said, a classroom problem now is no longer a problem. It's something for me to really think about. She said, I kind of really enjoy acting with understanding and purpose in the middle. But also she said she likes the degree of abstraction, moving between abstraction and application in what she does. So that's the trajectory of Amy. So we see she moved from inquiry as a tool to a responsibility to something that for her gave her meaning and purpose. Okay, So time matters, we can track trajectories. I'm only doing, oh yes, so with agency you can zoom out or zoom in. I'm mostly going to be zooming in, looking right at small moments, but you can zoom out this way. And so that's kind of zooming out, so time matters. And then also context matters. So I'm going to talk about Charles in Viet Nam. And he begins talking about himself this way. I started to feel there was something, oh, this is in his written narrative, sorry, that pencil means written narrative. I started to feel there was something routine and missing about my teaching career. He said, I'd been teaching EAP for 5 years. Only 5 years. It's feeling routine and missing, goodness. I felt like I was in a circle doing the same things on and on in my work with almost nothing new. So here he's starting off very much thinking about himself, what he's thinking in the moment, but also probably looking ahead, given that he's saying 5 years, there's a long way to go yet. So he was thinking about teaching. What's teaching like? Is this kind of all there is? And then he says, so he did a PhD, but then he came back to Viet Nam and was quite concerned because he said, I need to do something that's really practical, down to earth. When I share my research with the local community, I have to find something they can identify themselves with their own practice. I love this last bit. I have to do something that suits the local market. So he's actually got a number of very good publications, but he's come back to Vietnam, this much more theorized work. It's not suiting the local market. And implicit in this, which comes out later, is this responsibility to other teachers and to colleagues. So I need to do something that's also good for and with other people. Carrying on, his identity. He said, so in Vietnam, he said that the Ministry of Education and Training, you can do research, you're not paid to do it, you can do research. If you don't do research, according to, or scholarship, you have 200 extra hours of teaching a year. So you can choose. So that's your choice. Okay, so given that choice, a lot of colleagues prefer to teach. I'm interested in research because it's my interest, but also then I don't feel I'm falling behind. So in agency, you think, who do you feel responsible to or accountable to? It's like he feels accountable to himself. I have to do this for myself, otherwise I could be falling behind. I need to keep up to date. But what Charles finds is that his steps towards scholarship mean new accountabilities to colleagues. It's a university requirement. Every year we have conferences. Everyone needs to contribute an article. I have to encourage my colleagues to write. They're not comfortable. They prefer to teach. So in moving forward in scholarship, he also needs, in this sociocultural context, to take others with him, which is a new accountability. But he's nonetheless still inspired by this sense of who he wants to be in his work. He says, my colleagues who, instead of research, do those hours of teaching, those 200 hours, they're not happy with that, even though they can do that, because they feel guilty, because they cannot do research. They have to hide behind the colleagues who can do research. So he's saying you always feel on the back foot. Also, they feel they're not doing something meaningful, they're not contributing to the community, and this comes out later. So for him, although research isn't an easy space, it means taking colleagues with you, and so nonetheless, this is something he wants to do. Now, very briefly, so we've looked at change over time, we've looked in a particular sociocultural context. Before I come on to looking at the teacher focus group discussion, I want to look at people at different stages of their career and different stages of scholarship. So it's kind of two things I'm melding here. In other words, sort of like whether we often talk about whether people are novice or experienced EAP practitioners, that's one thing. These people vary a bit in that, but also the stage of scholarship they're working in. And I'm going to start with Irene, and I think what characterises Irene is that when I interviewed her, she's very much on a threshold, so in terms of starting out. And the notion of threshold is quite common in writings of agency. So the idea is, I'm here, do I enter or don't I enter? And maybe do I enter here or do I enter here or do I enter here? How do I enter? So that idea of a threshold. So here's Irene. She's forever trying to balance out the feasible, what I can do in my work hour, with the desire to do a project that's methodologically sound. In Irene's case too, we see someone in quite a sensitive space, which I think we'll all be very familiar with, between your hopes and desires and sense of what you can do, or what you want to do, or what you recognise as important, but also which is not as yet realisable. You'd feel you can't quite realise what's important. So Irene's very interesting as being in this quite sensitive space. Also, she wanted a project that kind of has longevity, that she can move into later. And the project had to be ready for the ethics approval process, which is obviously difficult. So if we look at this again using this typology, her context, there are many dimensions to her context, but one is her work hour allocation. So that's a constraint for her. And what's she trying to do? She's trying to balance out what's feasible, what's methodologically sound, and her awareness is it has to be a sound project. Of course, you can do a project, but she felt it was important to do a sound project and also something with longevity. So she's on the threshold here, trying to find the space for this. Carrying on. I love these three. I got to the critical point where I'm bursting with ideas and have done enough reading, but all will be in vain unless I can find a critical friend. How so? We shall see. I will be tangled in my thoughts, a never-ending circle of reading, discovering and doubting again if I cannot share my thoughts and progress regularly. So why is that so important? Why does she want to restructure her environment to find this critical friend? You shall see. Without feedback and a structured plan of action, I will not do SOTL. So she gives a hint, I need feedback. But the critical friend is more than that. So let's see. So here she's restructuring the context. She's going to act to find this critical friend. So what she's done, I've got 3 colleagues who will be critical friends. She's chosen them on their basis of their character and their traits. So again, you don't just choose any old person. You think quite judiciously, how do I act? We had our first meeting and it was useful just to chat about all those ideas in my head. She says just to chat, but actually it's never just chatting. It's much more complex than that, this action she's taken. You'll see in a moment. We agreed to meet regularly, every 6 weeks. So she's restructuring her environment to get some regularity to this. But she says, this is the point about just talking. Exposing my ideas to the critique of just one person is enough to make me nervous, but it's what I need to build confidence that I can do SOTL. So it's like, if I talk with you about it, it helps me with ideas, but as we've seen for scholarship, it's about going public. So these 3 critical friends, it's beginning to go into that space. I'm going to have to speed up. I'll go much faster. Okay, Nico. Nico is really interesting. She did a scholarship project in about over a matter of months, very quickly. Why did she do that? Well, she was teaching a class on reading strategies and was really concerned that she felt she wasn't doing what reading strategies say we should do. And she, I guess the class didn't go that well. We all had those classes. So she asked this question, how could I belong if I was finding it hard to do the very thing I was trying to empower the students to do? How could I teach students to engage in academic practice when I wasn't myself? And then I started wondering, that was her action. So this is the intrapersonal dialogue, which also, dialogue with yourself, inside yourself, that is also a critical part of scholarship. I started wondering how my colleagues felt and whether they had similar questions about academic practice or whether they had ever doubted their academic authenticity within the university context. I think that resonates, doesn't it? But she's thinking, so scholarship for her is a way also to kind of validate some of the questions she had. This was written narrative. Then, very quickly, we were being encouraged to engage with SOTL. There was a PIM, BALEAP PIM, and I thought this would allow me to undertake a small-scale project that would help me explore my own relationship to academic practice, along with questions about belonging and place within the academy. So it's kind of a personal quest, but also, it's a personal quest, but also looking to see, is some sort of validation, is this how others feel? So she was very interested in that. Oh, that was the written one. Then she did many things. A deadline was looming, ethics, participants, interviews, analyse. She enjoyed the interviews, hearing about what was important to them and how they saw themselves within the university. So she found the process of that really enjoyable. Then early hours of the morning and late in the evening, transcribing, categorising. While I enjoyed it, I felt a little resentful that it was eating into home life. It's a very demanding process. It wasn't just the time, but it's quite a demanding process. It was so positive and affirming in terms of her relationships with colleagues, but I soon became aware of the ethical implications. When participants were so close to home, it got real. How can I accurately, respectfully, and safely represent and interpret people's words was a real concern. I have really felt that in this process too. How do you do that? So she felt she needed to be very careful with that. So she had that sense of answerability or accountability to her colleagues as well. Not just in terms of anonymity, but representing them. And then I love this, the day of the BALEAP PIM. When I went to deliver the talk to the BALEAP PIM, it was such a lovely experience. In one of the last sessions, I thought no one was going to turn up. It was a packed room, standing room only, and I was so nervous. But something about it, I think my pride in my fellow participants, that it came through, and I could see people nodding their heads. The response was really positive and really lovely. It was such a nice experience. So here we see that these events are hugely personally meaningful for people. I must say, I've been very relieved at the nod, so please keep nodding with that. Nico, though, then rested this project for quite a while, because I think this is something we're going to see in scholarship, that it's, for some people, it's a spurt activity. You do something, then you need to have a rest, yes, and then spurt again there. Finally, I want to talk about Julia. I've only got one slide. So Julia is a really experienced researcher, has done many excellent publications, really enjoys this, feels more at ease teaching EAP. I'm just going to move on quickly, recognises that it's important. I'll just move here. But says here, I think scholarship's in my blood. I just like to know things, to do things better. Brings more satisfaction and fulfillment. I feel like I'm more myself. So this is very interesting in terms of numerous strands of identity here. But there's a conflict. I'm aware of the implications on my private life. I've been doing it in my free time. I'm resistant to doing it now. I kind of refuse to do it in my own time because I'm trying to find work-life balance as well. I think it's important. So here we see people think she feels answerable to herself for her own work-life balance. She can achieve scholarship. Now she's trying to achieve work-life balance. So I think here we see the ongoing negotiation. But I would say this was Julia on one day. So it's very interesting in agency and narrative accounts to be aware this is what this person, the account they were giving of themselves on that day in that moment. It's not kind of the fixed narrative. Okay, now, 58 minutes. So the third phase of data gathering was getting teachers together to talk about scholarship. I've done several of these, including by Skype. This one was a face-to-face one by 5 colleagues who knew each other, 5 colleagues plus me. And then basically I asked kind of 2 questions. Is this question a bit odd in the UK? It's quite standard in New Zealand. What are the standouts for you in scholarship? Anyway, this was the first one I did. It didn't get off to a great start because people were, what do you mean? So in other words, kind of, when you think about the scholarship experience, what do you think about? And then asked a second question later, what has embarking on scholarship meant for you? Now, there were actually 5 points here. The whole point of doing this was how do teachers collectively talk about scholarship given these very open questions? And generally what happens in these kinds of discussions, people kind of give monologues for a while, but then there were 5 points when people really talked together about what was going on. So I'm going to show you those 5 points very quickly. And what did I mean by when people came together? There was a lot of, that's right, and I think. Sitting listening to you is really helpful. So this is alignment. There was a lot of alignment, you see that? And more qualified degrees of alignment or divergence. Okay, do you see this is kind of hedging? I'm not sure if I know this might be the same. Yes? So I've analysed this. And here, there were kind of 5 themes across, though you don't really do thematic stuff across looking at agency, but these 5 themes emerged. And people started off talking about time. Takes a back seat, especially during the summer, scholarship does. I'm jumping in and out of things, you lose momentum. In fact, this topic, they said, we're all going to say the same thing, it's time. And I thought, oh, well, that's going to be a short focus group, but it moved on. Then there was a discussion about, well, what is scholarship? And there was this, must have an outcome, outputs, you have to show something. And then somebody said, that's not so difficult if you've found something you want to say. So that's kind of, it can have a meaning there. But that also, the time thing as well is not so bad if you found something you want to say. And making it public, obviously, if you're doing that. And it's about finding your niche. Okay, I'll leave that now, sorry about that. And then finding my niche emerged. If you can find an idea that really works, that person didn't elaborate on that. I did a lot of nodding. But then somebody said, but it's the scale of the thing. I found something that worked, but it was just too big. I've had to narrow it down. It's got to fit into a manageable task. And somebody said, oh, well, if it's got an endpoint, that's easier. And then somebody came back and said, no, my ideas were all just too big in a 14-hour working week. So it's not just a matter of finding your focus, but then identifying the scale of it that's manageable for time. These were all interrelated. The next bit. What's the meaning of it? I know a lot less than I thought I knew. There were a lot of laughs about that. Somebody came back, oh, for me it's just been a tag on. If I've got an afternoon, I'll do something. So that's where they were at with that. Then somebody said, because I haven't actually produced anything, it doesn't actually feel that different apart from the interviewing process. So it kind of was perhaps more like other inquiries. So the producing something was the big barrier. Then somebody raised identity. It's helped me carve out an identity. I can start to feel where I fit in the field. This person talked about moving from just doing the reading or going to BALEAP PIMs. Think about here. Going to BALEAP PIMs, saying, rather than just attending them now, I feel I'm kind of really participating in there. So I think it's a move from engaging with research to engaging in research. English prepositions are wonderful like that, from with research to in research, like that. Okay, I'll carry on here. So this person, I didn't know where I fitted in. Now I'm engaging with you. So a shift, and again, it's nice to think that in these conferences, different people are at different points. And this raises an important point about empathy and professional empathy. And I'm going to show this because I think agency, accountability, and empathy are often interrelated here. So here this person was saying, when I think of some of the things I said, now I feel really difficult thinking, embarrassed, thinking I knew a lot here. So they were saying, so sometimes people say something and you think, but then I think let's not say anything because they're also on the path. I really like that quote. It's about professional respect and empathy and recognition of the path people are on. And people go, and then someone said, yeah, I have to be very careful what I say now. And they came back, no, what I mean is I get it. So this was this kind of negotiation for scholarship. Okay, almost finished. Last one. We've had a look at that. Finding the niche, somebody again coming back to this. I think that's the exciting part and the hard part. What's going to be my niche? Somebody else saying, it's got to feel authentic. It's got to speak to you. It can't just be any old thing. And also, you don't want to manufacture your niche. It's like your lived experience. So it's, again, this is an identity area. And then somebody's saying, if somebody's gone through a crucible experience and really thought about it, then it's useful listening to people. So this idea, that's kind of another version of authenticity, isn't it? That you think, oh, that person's really thought about that practice. The view, you can have better conversations now. Herman's has got a very nice phrase that you have more, well, he says more voices in the landscapes of the mind, but I think it's more perspectives or more vantage points. When you've done scholarship or done a lot of reading and so on, you can see things from different vantage points. And that's important because that actually helps you interpret and make sense of what's going on from that. So this is the value of scholarship. Somebody says there's still the whole dead down thing. I love it. And then somebody said, if there were consequences to me not doing it, I'd get it done. And then the lovely bit, but we want meaningful scholarship, don't we? This was a very nice negotiation. I like this too. I feel really positive when I'm doing it, but then I'll have a week where I don't have 2 seconds to myself. So you can see the way the topics and perspectives circulate. Okay, I'm just going to go to my conclusions now. So basically, here we can see how and why agency gets talked about, how people are thinking a lot about how they act and why. There's a lot about thinking about answerability or accountability when you talk about agency. I think agency is really useful to understand decisions and trajectories. And also the value of professional practice and scholarship as professional practice has come through in this study. And finally, for the conference theme, innovation, exploration and transformation, agency is a really useful framework to look at these processes, these very demanding processes of innovation, exploration and transformation. Those are my references, and thank you for listening. Sorry I went over time.